She looked him in the eye across a stone table and dropped 7 medals into a crucible that ran hotter than a small sun. The nickel sagged first. The ribbons flashed and vanished in a small, prim puff of ash. The pressed sigils, 7 proud, complicated things that had once meant something to somebody, slumped into each other and became a bright, soft nothing. The Empress of the Vora Ascendancy did not blink. Neither did the human on his knees at the far side of the room, whose medals those had been. He was 5 feet 9, 37 standard years, a widower steward from a Terran mill town no one in the palace had ever heard of. The freight registry called him domestic cleaning. He had cost her less than a good tea service. The court laughed for a week. Every dawn after that, he knelt at the door of her private study and polished the vulgar brass doorknob she had made from his old life. He did not weep. He hummed. And on the 90th night, when 35 polymer blades came whispering through her ventilation to open her throat and end her line, the Empress of the Vora Ascendancy learned, at some price, that the freight registry had misfiled a man. 90 mornings earlier, the air on the auction gantry at Broken Halo Station tasted of copper, burnt ozone, and cheap machine oil. The overhead lights were the color of an old bruise. Somewhere below deck, a station bell rang the hour, and a woman with too many rings on the wrong hand called the third lot of the morning to the floor. Ismariel Venn, whose true name was a bracelet of shale clicks, the collar translator flattened on its best day to the borrowed sound. Ismariel did not attend the freight auctions in person. Empresses did not. Empresses did not walk the outer rings of Broken Halo Station either, or wear a plain hood that hid the ridges of an inherited crown, or purchase servants directly from a registry known chiefly for cheating. But the Harvest Festival was in 3 weeks, and the diplomatic gauntlet after it in 5, and the 2 Vora women she had trusted to bring her back, a fresh household steward, had both come home with pretty, dying things she pitied and could not use. So she went herself. She stood in the second row, and she watched a small, brown-haired mammal in a scavenger's coat step onto the block and refuse to be frightened of anybody. He was not tall. She had seen taller humans at trade summits. He had a wide, patient face and slow eyes the color of wet stone, and he stood with the loose ease of a man who has already decided the day cannot be worse than yesterday. The auctioneer read out his file in the flat sing-song of the well-paid liar. Wade Corbin, Terran, 37 years, widower, prior work, domestic cleaning, kitchen fetch, ship steward, funeral attendant. No dependents, no debt, no sentimental attachment to any employer, previous or otherwise. Cheap, an off-world broker in a bone mask bid first. Ismariel Venn bid second, without looking away from the man on the block, and closed the lot before the third bid had time to rise. Nobody argued with the plain woman in the hood. The plain woman in the hood, paid in the local currency, walked around to the loading dock and pointed at Wade Corbin. "You," she said, "in trade. With me." He looked up at her. He looked at her boots, which cost more than the auction floor. He looked at the coat, which did not. He nodded once and picked up the small canvas bag that appeared to be his only possession. "Ma'am," he said. The translator around her throat, a slim collar the color of a river fish, took the flat gravel of the human word and made it something the Vora ear could hold. It did not know what to do with the tone underneath it. It was, she thought, the tone of a man who had heard people call him worse things and was still here. "There is nothing sentimental about me either," she said. "That's fine, ma'am," said Wade Corbin. He carried the bag onto her private cutter. He did not look back at Broken Halo Station. He did not ask her name. She had bought him for the second month of the festival because her old steward, a very old Vora man named Palok, had died in the 63rd day of a very reasonable illness, and because her mother, who had never approved of Ismariel Venn, and who now lived in a stone tower on the edge of the sea with 3 attendants and a great many opinions, had written to say the harvest festival cutlery required a human touch. Humans, the letter said, were docile, dexterous, cheap, and above all reliably invisible. A Vora household of any respectable size ought to have at least one. It was fashion. It was also a good insult if the human happened to be an old soldier. Ismail Venn had never met a human before Wade Corbin. She had seen them across trade tables. She had listened to two of them argue about a shipping tariff in a language her collar could not quite keep up with. She had thought at the time that humans looked like small, tired mammals who moved through a room as though they had already decided the room did not deserve them. Wade Corbin moved through her cutter like that. He looked at the black glass ceiling of the passenger cabin and did not gasp. He looked at the plasma veil that separated crew from cargo and did not touch it. He accepted the bunk he was given, and the ration bar he was given, and the water flask he was given, and thanked the courier who gave him each thing. "Your file is a lie," she said, on the third hour. He was sitting on the bunk. His shoes were off. He was folding them precisely into the small canvas bag. "Ma'am," he said without looking up, "I would not call it a lie. You are a soldier. I was a lot of things. Which of them is the lie?" He looked up. His slow, stone eyes were very steady. She was told later that human faces, when they were still, betrayed almost nothing. "None of them," he said. "But the paperwork I was sold under was signed by a clerk in the hectare system who was paid to file the first job I did with my hands and none of the ones I did with my brain. I did not correct her. That was 5 years ago. I am not going to correct her now." "Why?" He looked down at his folded shoes. "Because I was ready to be done with the other work," he said. "Because a man who stops doing that work needs a story he can live inside of. Because if I told the registry I was a soldier, they would sell me to a place I would have to keep on being one." "Ma'am." She thought about that for the rest of the flight. She had not expected him to answer at all. She had expected him to lie. Instead, he had told her, on the third hour of their acquaintance, that his life on the manifest was a costume he had cut for himself, and that he preferred the costume. She could have unwound the costume there. She did not. She was the empress of the Vora ascendancy, and it was her business to know a thing about a person nobody else in the room knew. She let him keep his shoes and his story and his small canvas bag. She flew him home. The palace of the Vora ascendancy sat on the shoulder of a black mountain on the world called Huraka, at the end of the third arm of the second spiral of a galactic disk that was in most places friendly to the empress, and in a few important places not. The palace was built of obsidian glass and rose-red stone. The private study, the one Ismail Venn used when she did not want a witness, was a small, high, cold room with a single door at its center and a plasma veil at its back that opened onto a private garden. The door had a lock that a child could pick. It had never mattered. The door had a hinge of old plain Vora iron that had been in the palace for 11 generations. It had never mattered. The door had a knob. The knob had been a plain thing of dark, polished wood for 11 generations. On the second morning of Wade Corbin's ownership, the empress of the Vora ascendancy summoned the crucible master and the palace smith to her private study. She showed them the 7 human medals she had already put into a small brass box on her writing desk. She told them what she wanted done. The crucible master, whose profession did not permit him to be surprised, did not look surprised. The smith, whose profession did not either, did. "The knob, Majesty," said the smith. "The knob," said Ismail Venn. Wade Corbin, who had been standing at the door in the plain grey tunic of a household servant for the whole conversation, did not react. His hands hung at his sides. His slow stone eyes rested on the crucible master's shoulder, which was where he had been told to rest them. "Come here," the empress said. He came. She opened the box on the desk. Inside were the 7 medals. She had studied them the night before, one by one, under a good light. 6 of them she had recognized only by shape, the way you recognize a foreign coin. 2 of them she had made her collar translator read out for her. It had struggled. The words on them were, in one case, for the retrieval of 11 human civilians from a burning atmospheric processor at a place called Bright Fork, and in the other, for the recovery of the body of a comrade under sustained plasma fire at a place the collar could only render as a set of coordinates. The medals were made of an alloy that was not really nickel. They were pressed, they were heavy, they were beautiful. "These are yours," she said to him. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you want them back?" He looked at her then, for the first time all morning. Something moved in the wet stone of his eyes. It was very small, and it was gone almost at once. "They are not mine anymore, ma'am." She held his gaze a beat longer than was polite. Then she took the box and tipped its contents into the crucible master's black-gloved palm. "Melt them," she said. "Majesty," said the crucible master. "Cast the metal into a doorknob," she said. "For this door, the shape of any decent doorknob you like, vulgar, brass, yellow, something the eye cannot ignore." She turned to Wade Corbin. Her voice, when she spoke to him, was not cruel. It was, if anything, a little curious. It was the voice a scientist uses on a specimen she has not yet decided whether to keep. "Every morning," she said, "before the 3rd bell, you will kneel at this door and polish that knob with a cloth. You will polish it until it shines. You will polish it until my face shows in it. You will do this every morning until you are dead, or I am dead, or the door is not." "Yes, ma'am," said Wade Corbin. She waited for him to flinch. He did not flinch. The court laughed for a week. The heir consort, Prince Ecthel of the 4th Spire, laughed loudest. He was tall for a Vora, which was to say very tall, a black-glazed spar of a man with the shoulder ridges of a warrior line and the smile of a courtier. He had married into Ismariel Ven's household 18 months earlier because their 2 great families had needed the knot, and because the empress had needed a consort who could shake hands with the 4th Spire and not stab anyone at the reception. He had made the empress laugh twice at their wedding. He had not made her laugh since. This, in the palace, was not held against him. Vora marriages did not run on laughter. They ran on the truce. Prince Ecthol came to visit the doorknob on the 3rd day of its life. He stood at the mouth of the private study, with 2 of his household guard at his back, and he watched Wade Corbin polish the ugly brass knob with a soft yellow cloth. "Little mammal," said Prince Ecthol in the courtly Vora that his collar translated for the human with a lag of a full second. "What is your name?" "Wade Corbin, my lord." "Wade Corbin. That is a mouth of vowels." "Yes, my lord." "Are you angry, Wade Corbin?" "No, my lord." "Are you sad, Wade Corbin?" "No, my lord." "Are you ashamed, Wade Corbin?" "No, my lord." The prince tilted his head. The shoulder ridges under his silks moved with the tilt, small, hard plates the color of old teeth. "What are you, then?" Wade Corbin did not stop polishing. The rag went around the brass in the slow, even circles of a man who had done a great deal of polishing in his life. "I am the man who polishes the door, my lord." Prince Ecthel laughed. His household guard laughed a beat later, the way household guards always laugh. He clapped the human on the shoulder with the flat of his hand, hard enough that it should have made the human stagger. The human did not stagger. He rocked forward a hand's width and rocked back and kept polishing. The prince noticed. He did not say anything about it. He turned and walked out and told the whole court at dinner about the mammal on his wife's floor. It made a very fine story. Ismariel Ven, at the head of the table, ate slowly and said nothing. She had been sitting at the window of the private study that morning, in her reading chair, with a decanter and a book, when Wade Corbin had knelt and started to polish the knob. She had not spoken to him. He had not spoken to her. He had polished for a full hour, and after a while he had begun, very quietly, to hum. The tune was in a mode her collar did not know how to name. It was small and round, and had a wobble at the end of each line. She had listened to it for the length of 2 chapters of her book. She had not asked him what it was. She had watched, in the smoked black glass above the door, the man on his knees hum a lullaby to a lump of pressed nickel that had once been his life. She had not laughed. She thought about that lullaby now, at dinner, while her husband made a joke about a mammal on a floor. She thought about it later, in her private study, when she opened the door herself and saw the brass knob shining like a small, vulgar sun, and saw her face, the ridges of her inherited crown, the pale, bright line of her mouth, the very old and very tired eyes she showed to almost no one, smeared and shining in the polish. She stood with her hand on the knob for a long time. She did not that night understand herself. She would have said, if asked, that she owned a human because it was fashion, and that she had melted his medals because it was a good insult, and that she required him to polish the door because it entertained her. All those things were true. She would not have said, if asked, that she had wanted to see what a man looked like when he did not break. The days ran. Wade Corbin polished the knob at the 3rd bell every morning. He did other work also. He served her tea. He turned down her sheets. He cleaned her writing pens. He walked at her elbow through the low garden. He did not speak unless spoken to. He did not touch anything he had not been told to touch. He did not steal. He did not weep. He did not, so far as any court spy could report, curse her. He did sometimes hum. Twice in the first fortnight, the palace children, Prince Echthal's 4 young cousins by his mother's line, who lived in the East Wing and had the run of the corridors, came to the door of the private study and hid behind the pillar in the outer hall and watched him polish. They dared each other to walk up and touch him. The youngest, a bright-eyed girl child with a broken shoulder ridge and a permanent sulk, actually did. She pushed a small, hard finger into the back of his neck and squealed and ran. Wade Corbin did not flinch. He turned his head a hand's width to see who was there, and seeing her run away, turned back and kept polishing. The empress, watching from her chair, saw the muscle at the corner of his jaw move a single time and go still. The court had a name for him by the 3rd week. They called him the doorknob's priest. Prince Echthal had coined it. It caught on. He was, at dinner and in the courtyards, a joke that had already stopped being funny and that the palace kept telling anyway because the joke was not really about him. It was about her. It was a way to say the empress kept a small, dying pet and had not yet noticed it was dead. She noticed a different thing. On the 21st day, one of the tall courier Vora in the outer corridor drew a spar knife on another over the outcome of a dice cup. The knives were ceremonial. The reason was not. Wade Corbin, who was passing through the corridor on his way from the kitchen with a tray, set the tray down against the wall without breaking a cup, walked between the 2 of them, and took the knife out of the first one's hand. He did not, so far as the corridor spies reported, use force. He walked into the arc of the strike, caught the wrist, turned the wrist over, and lifted the knife off the palm of the Vora courier the way you lift a spoon out of a soft egg. He handed the knife hilt first to the second courier, who was more surprised than the first, and said in the polite trade dialect his collar had learned, "Gentlemen, my lady does not permit spilling in the halls. Please take this discussion outside." Then he picked up his tray and finished walking to the kitchen. He did not spill a cup. The 2 couriers stood in the corridor for a long time after he had gone. Then they went outside. They did not fight there either. Ismariel Ven heard about the knife inside the hour. She did not summon him. She did not mention it. She watched him polish the doorknob the next morning and marked, in the private ledger she kept behind her ear, that the man was faster than she had known. Prince Echthal, when he heard, did mention it. He came to the private study that evening. Wade Corbin was not on his knees this time. He was pouring tea. The prince refused the tea. He stood over the human and looked down at him with the flat, considering look Vora men wore before a hunt. Where did you learn to take a knife off a wrist, little mammal? Wade Corbin did not look up from the tea. My father was a butcher, my lord. Was he? Yes, my lord. In a cold town on earth, he used to take a cleaver away from my brother the same way when my brother had had too much to drink. It is the same motion. Show me. My lord? Show me the motion. Wade Corbin set down the pot. He looked at Prince Ekthal for a moment. Then he stepped forward, slow enough for a child to follow, and touched the prince's wrist with 2 fingers. You put your thumb here, my lord. You turn. The hand opens. The knife falls. If the hand does not open, you have taken the wrong wrist. I would not use it on a man who was ready for it. My brother was never ready. He stepped back. He picked up the pot. Prince Ekthal looked down at his own wrist for a long time. He did not laugh that night at dinner. Ismariel Ven, at the head of the table, watched him not laugh and thought about the private ledger behind her ear and added a second line. On the 38th day, the human broke. He did not break loudly. He did not break the way she had expected. He did not weep. He did not run. He was on his knees at the door of her private study before the 3rd bell, polishing the vulgar brass knob with a fresh rag, when the humming stopped in the middle of a bar, and his hand stopped in the middle of a circle, and he sat back on his heels with his eyes closed for a very long moment. She was in her reading chair. She lowered her book. Wade Corbin. Ma'am? His voice was steady. His eyes were still closed. What was that? I was thinking about my sister, ma'am. Which sister? I only had the one. Her name was Rhea. She used to sing the tune I Hum, ma'am. I was thinking about the winter we were 14 and 11, and we ran out of coal, and she sang the tune all night to keep me warm, and I remembered just now that she is dead. He said it in the same steady voice he had used to describe the wrist. He opened his eyes. He looked at her. There was no self-pity in his face. There was only the flat surprise of a man who has remembered a fact he has been keeping in a drawer. How old was she? Ismariel Ven said after a moment. 28, ma'am, when she died. It has been 9 years. Was she ill? No, ma'am. She was on the 3rd gantry at the Ashfork mill when the boiler stack blew. She was one of the 11 bodies they recovered whole. There were another 7 they did not. He said the number 7 in the same voice she had heard him say every number. She noticed the number. She noticed also that she had, without meaning to, put down her book. I am sorry for your sister, she said. It came out of her before she had chosen it. She could not remember in her life having said those words to another person. Thank you, ma'am. He picked up the rag. He started polishing again. The humming did not come back that morning. She sat in her chair with her book on her lap and watched him work. She thought about the 7 medals in the crucible. She thought about the first one the translator had read. Bright fork. A burning atmospheric processor. 11 civilians. She thought about her ledger. She did not add a line to it that day. Instead, she reached up with her long, pale hand and touched the ridges of her inherited crown, and thought, very slowly, that her joke had become a different joke, and she had not been told. The 40th day arrived like all the others, and on the 40th day, in the great outer archive, in a room of cold air and slow light and the smell of old paper, one of Prince Ekthal's household clerks pulled the human's file off the wall. The clerk was named Vaskin, and he was young, and he had been told by his prince to find out whether it was true that the mammal on the empress's floor had been a butcher's boy. Prince Ekthal had grown over the last week, quietly obsessive about the wrist. He had not liked how his own wrist had looked when the human touched it. Vaskin was thorough. He was also bored. He pulled not only the freight registry entry for one Wade Corbin, Terran domestic, but every cross-reference the palace archive could match against the name, the date of birth, the port of origin, and the tissue prints the auction house had scanned onto the sale. Most of the cross-references were empty. 2 of them were not. The first was a Terran military archive that the palace had subscribed to in the 68th year of the Empress's grandfather's reign and had never once been asked to open. It was open now. It had a file with Wade Corbin's tissue prints attached. The file was very short. It said, Corbin, Wade Ellis, Terran Assault Recovery Command, 22nd Long Corps, enlisted at 19, discharged at 30, 11 years of service, 8 combat tours, 3 commendations for saving lives, 2 commendations for taking them. Special note, subject was born and reared to age 19 on Cygnus K, a Terran mining colony operating at 1.9 standard gravities. Density-adjusted physical performance on record. The second was a scrap of a report from a Terran Freight Arbitration Council. It said that a broker in the Hector system had, on the 3rd quarter of the 94th Terran year, filed a false employment classification for a Terran veteran seeking passage off-world after the death of his spouse. The classification had gone through. The veteran had asked for it to go through. Attached, name, Wade Ellis Corbin, previous occupation soldier, requested occupation domestic. Signed acknowledgement both parties. Vaskeen read the 2 files together. He read them a second time. He carried them quickly to his prince. Prince Ekthal read them on his balcony in the wet gold afternoon light. He read them very slowly. When he was done, he handed them back to the clerk and said, in a voice the clerk did not know, "Burn these. Speak of them to no one, not to the Empress, not to my mother, not to any human, foreign or domestic. I will decide what is to be done." Vaskien bowed. He carried the 2 files into the archive fire. He did not know, and Prince Ekthal did not tell him, that on the balcony after the clerk had gone, the prince stood with his long pale hands on the black stone rail and looked out over the city of the Vora Ascendancy and thought for the first time in his 18 months in that palace that his wife's small dying pet was a knife. He did not tell her about the file. He wrote that night 3 letters. The first was to his mother in a private cipher. The second was to a broker in the Croth outer belt in an even more private cipher. The third was to a very old friend in the 9 Moons contract house in a cipher that had no name. He signed the third with his own hand. He would remember later in the throne chamber that this had been the mistake. The Empress of the Vora Ascendancy did not know about any of this. She only knew that on the 45th day her husband looked at her at dinner over the small purple bowls and said in the very mild voice he used for very unmild things, "My love, the mammal on your floor is a curiosity. Have you not tired of him yet?" "No," she said. "He would fetch a good price back on the outer belt. He is not for sale. He is only a human." "He is my human," she said, and she was surprised by her own voice, which had come out with an edge she had not put in it. Prince Ekthal smiled. He raised his cup. He drank. The 45th day ended. The days ran on. Wade Corbin polished the doorknob at the 3rd bell each morning. He served the tea. He walked in the low garden. Twice more he intervened in the corridors, both times without a blow struck. The couriers began to nod to him. The palace children began to stop hiding behind the pillar and started instead sitting on the floor of the outer hall in a small cross-legged line while he polished, watching him hum. He tolerated it. He did not once touch a Vora child. On the 60th day, an old crucible hand died in the palace foundry, and among his kit was found a small crumpled slip of paper on which he had written down, in the shaky trade script of a working man, that when the Empress's steward had melted the Empress's mammal's medals on the 2nd day of the mammal's residence, the crucible had, in cooling, thrown up an odd pattern of 7 small pressed sigils across the top of the slag. The sigils, the old crucible hand had written, had all been the household mark of the 4th spire. The old crucible hand had been going to tell somebody. He had not quite decided who. He had died in his sleep with the paper folded under his pillow. The paper reached the palace archive on the 62nd day. It was filed in the wrong bin. It was found on the 68th day by a middle-rank clerk who did not know what the fourth spire mark meant. It was flagged by the middle-rank clerk to her supervisor on the 70th day. The supervisor recognized the mark and, being a cautious woman, carried the paper to the Empress's own private secretary rather than to the prince's staff. The private secretary held it for 6 days before she brought it to the Empress. Ismariel Ven read the paper in her private study, at the desk under the window, with the doorknob catching the light of a low, late sun. She read it twice. She turned it over. There was nothing on the back. She looked up at the doorknob. She looked at her secretary. "Where is Palok?" she said. "Majesty," said the secretary, "Palok died in the 63rd day of his illness, almost 3 months ago, before we bought the human. You have not had a steward since who could have been careless with the medals. Do the 7 human medals bear the 4th spire mark?" "No, Majesty." "Then how did the sigils get into the slag?" "That is the question, Majesty." She sent the secretary away. She did not send for her husband. She did not send for the crucible master. She sat at her desk in the last of the sun and looked at the doorknob and thought. Someone in the household of the 4th spire had put 7 4th spire tokens into the crucible before the medals were melted. Perhaps the day before. Perhaps the hour before. Perhaps the tokens had been dropped in by the crucible master himself at the direction of a person he was afraid of. Perhaps they had been dropped in by the smith. Perhaps they had been dropped in by the old crucible hand who had died in his sleep with a paper under his pillow. She would find out which. She had time. But the tokens themselves had a meaning. In Vora household ritual, a 4th spire token melted into the metal of a threshold was a curse of severance. It was a very old thing. It was the sort of thing an old and very angry family did to a rival on the eve of a private war. It meant, the door of your house is not your door. It meant, whoever crosses this threshold does so at our mercy. Ekthal, she thought, or Ekthal's mother. She got up. She went to the door. She put her hand on the doorknob, which was smooth and warm from the day, and she pushed the door open, and she looked at Wade Corbin in the outer hall, who was standing by the window with a tray of small silver cups, because it was the 6th hour, and he had brought her the 6th hour tea. "Wade Corbin," she said, "set down the tray." He set it down. "Do you know," she said, "why I bought you?" "Because you needed a steward, ma'am." "That is what I said, yes. Is it not the truth, ma'am?" "It was in the 2nd row on the auction floor. I have been thinking since that it may not have been the whole truth." He did not answer. "I have been thinking," she said, "that I bought you because I wanted to know what a man looks like when he does not break." "Ma'am, you have not broken." "No, ma'am." "Do you know why?" He was quiet a long moment. He looked at the doorknob over her shoulder. He looked at her. "Ma'am," he said, "a man breaks when the thing he is being asked to do is worse than the thing he has already done. Polishing a doorknob is not worse than what I did before. It is a lot better." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. "There are people in this house," she said quietly, "who want to hurt me, perhaps very soon, perhaps very badly. Some of them are my husband's people. I do not yet know which. I will know before the month is out. When they will come by night, and they will come through the ventilation of my study because the door is watched, and the plasma veil is watched, and the ventilation is not. Do you know why I am telling you this?" "No, ma'am." "Because," she said, "I would like a steward who is faster than my couriers, and you are Wade Corbin. I do not know how much faster. I would like to know. You are dismissed." He picked up the tray. He walked out. He did not that night hum. He also did not that night sleep. He sat on the small cot in the small servant's cell 3 corridors from her study, and, in the dark, took stock of the tools he had. He had a rag. He had a broom. He had a mop with a wooden handle of a stiff, fine grain. He had a small folding knife the palace had permitted him because a household steward was expected to open packages and slice fruit. He had, in his small canvas bag, an item nobody had ever thought to look at, a length of black synthetic cord he had used on the freight cutter to tie his shoes together in his bag. He had a doorknob. He got up in the deep of the night, at a time before the 3rd bell, and he went barefoot down the corridor to the empress's private study, and he opened her door, and he took the vulgar brass doorknob off the door with the small folding knife and a great deal of patience. He put the doorknob into the pocket of his grey tunic. He put the shaft of the doorknob and its 2 small brass plates on the desk in a neat pile. He shut the door with the latch, and he went back to his cell. He sat on the small cot with the doorknob in his hands. He weighed it. It was heavier than it looked. He had known that. He had known since the 2nd morning exactly how heavy the empress's doorknob was, because he had polished it every dawn, and a rag knows the weight of a thing. He had not, until tonight, admitted to himself what he had been polishing it for. He said aloud to the empty cell, "All right." Then he lay down in his clothes, with the doorknob in his hand, and he slept. The 90th night came 4 bells later than she had expected. Wade Corbin had polished the empty doorknob shaft for 6 mornings by then. He had not put the knob back. The Empress had not asked. She had watched him polish the shaft as she had watched him polish the knob, and she had not laughed, and she had not asked, and she had said nothing about the 7 4th spire sigils, and she had looked at her husband at dinner as though she was seeing him for the first time as a stranger. Prince Ecthal had noticed the looks. He had moved his timing up. He had sent word to the very old friend in the 9 Moons contract house that the mammal on his wife's floor was more than the file said, and that the price of doing this thing was accordingly higher, and that the payment would be doubled. He had asked in the 3rd letter of the sequence that the mammal be taken first, and taken quietly before the Empress woke. The very old friend in the 9 Moons contract house had sent back one line. It said, "For that price we will send 35. The prince had approved. He had also, quietly, added a small further request. He had asked in the 4th letter that a skin of a slain Croth be delivered to him 3 days before the contract, and that he be permitted to enter the Empress's chambers with the assassins wearing that skin, and to be the one whose blade, in the confusion, opened his wife's throat. This request had cost him a further staggering payment. It had been granted. The very old friend in the 9 Moons contract house had signed the reply, as such letters were signed, with a set of 3 7-toothed marks. The prince had signed his own reply and his own name in his own hand. This had been convention. It had been also the mistake. On the 90th night, at a time between the 2nd and 3rd bells, 35 Croth assassins with polymer skin, the color of nothing at all, began to move through the ventilation of the private study of the Empress of the Vora ascendancy. One of them was Prince Ecthal of the 4th spire, wearing the tanned outer skin of a dead Croth over his silks. He carried a plasma lance under the skin. He carried, in the pocket of the skin, a folded letter with 3 7-toothed marks and his own name on it, because he had meant to burn the letter after the deed and had not yet had time. The Empress was not in her private study. She was in her sleeping chamber, 3 doors down, in her plain reading gown. Wade Corbin, in the Empress's private study, was. He was standing at the door, with his back to it in the dark. He was barefoot. He was wearing his grey tunic. He had his small folding knife in one hand and the vulgar brass doorknob in the other. He had the broom leaning against the wall on his left. He had the mop leaning against the wall on his right. He had the length of black synthetic cord in his teeth. He had also, 6 hours earlier, in the low garden, cut the wooden handle of the mop to a shorter and pointier length, with the small folding knife, and hidden a spare pre-tied loop of the black cord under the crucible master's third bell water bucket at the top of the corridor, in case the corridor became relevant. He had spent the day walking the palace exactly the way he had walked it every day. He had polished the empty doorknob shaft at the third bell. He had hummed. He was now in the dark, done humming. The first croth came down through the ventilation duct in the corner of the study at a soft, patient rate. The polymer of its skin made a small, dry whisper on the metal. It landed on the black stone floor in a low crouch. It did not see the human standing against the door because the door was in shadow and because it was not looking for a human. It was looking for the empress's bed. Wade Corbin walked forward at the speed of a slow, patient man. He met the first croth in 3 steps. He hit it in the side of the head with the vulgar brass doorknob. The knob was heavy. It made the small, wet crack of a boiled egg on the edge of a bowl. The croth went down without a sound. He caught it under the arms before it hit the floor. He set it, gently, on its side. He counted, in a whisper, in Terran English. His collar did not soften. 1. 2 more came down the duct in the next 4 seconds. He took the first with the mop shaft. He took the second by looping the black synthetic cord around its neck as it landed and closing the loop. He set both of them down. He counted 2, 3. He walked to the door, opened it a hand's width, looked out, closed it, walked back. 6 came down the duct in the following minute. He took 2 of them at the base of the duct, one with the shaft and one with the knob in the same motion. He took the next 3 with the mop shaft. He took the 6th with the black cord and the length of his own forearm across the throat. He set all 6 down. He counted 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. He was, at that point, bleeding from a small cut on his left hand, where the 6th croth had gotten a fingernail under his skin. He noted the cut. He wiped his palm on the leg of his grey tunic. He kept counting. He was, at that point, also being watched. Ismariel Ven was in her sleeping chamber, awake, in the plain reading gown. Behind a plasma veil she had lifted around her bed with her own hand 3 hours earlier. She had a small monitor in her palm that showed, in the flat grey of a courtyard camera, the door of her private study. She had lifted the monitor because she had heard, at the second bell, the very small sound of the first ventilation grill in the study coming out of its socket, and she had known. She was watching the door of her private study on her monitor. The door had not opened. Nobody had come out of it. Nothing had come out of it. And yet, in the corridor camera outside the door, she could see the shape of a small, human man walk very briefly past the doorway, look up the corridor, look back down, and vanish inside again. She could not, in the dark of the study, see what he was doing. She could only see the door and the corridor, and every so often the door opening a hand's width and the small brown-haired mammal looking out. She could hear, over the little audio feed of the monitor, a very quiet human voice counting. 10, said Wade Corbin in her ear 60 seconds later. 11, a moment after that. 12, 13. She held the monitor in both her hands. She stopped breathing for a bar. She started again. She thought, I am watching a small mammal move through my palace like a slow, patient tide. She thought, I am watching the freight registry find out what it has lost. She thought, and this she did not know had been in her head until it arrived. He is fighting for me. The count went to 15 at the 4th bell. It went to 20 at the sound of the little chime that marked 1/2 past. It went to 25 when a 9th ventilation grill came down and 3 croth came out of it at once. 26, 27, 28, 29. At 30, Wade Corbin was standing in the middle of the private study with the vulgar brass doorknob in his right hand and the mop shaft in his left, and 30 croth assassins in a slack line at his feet. He was bleeding from 3 places: his left hand, his right thigh, a shallow cut on his brow where a polymer edge had caught him during a duck. He was breathing hard. He was not hurt. He looked at the doorknob in his hand. There was a small, dark smear on the brass. He wiped it on his tunic. 30, he said. He waited. Nothing came out of the duct. The duct was silent. The room was silent. Somewhere in the palace, far off, a bell rang the 4th quarter. Wade Corbin lowered the doorknob. He stepped quietly over the cloth at his feet, and he went to the door of the study, and he opened it a hand's width, and he looked out into the corridor. There was nobody in the corridor. He knew there had been nobody in the corridor for 2 hours. The cloth had come in from above, and the exits at both ends of the corridor were sealed with the Empress's own private lock, and the plasma veil into the garden was up. He closed the door. He turned around, and he looked at the 30 cloth on the floor of the Empress's private study, and he did the small, unpleasant arithmetic he had been putting off since the count had reached 15. The 9 Moons contract house did not send 30. It sent 35. It sent 35 because 30 was the number of blades required by any competent hand to secure a chamber and its adjacent, and 35 was the number required to also, at leisure, kill the specific person the contract had named. 5 extra, always. It was the house style. He had counted 30. He was missing 3. He realized, also missing 2. He said aloud in the dark room, in the same Terran English his collar refused to soften, 30, but there were 35 sent, 3 more in the walls. Then, a beat later, and 2 more that were never in the walls. He put the vulgar brass doorknob into the pocket of his grey tunic. He picked up the mop shaft. He walked out of the private study into the corridor, at the speed of a man who has already decided the corridor cannot get worse than the study. The 3 that were in the walls came down at the corridor turning. He knew they would. There was a service duct at the corridor turning that ran to the outer roof, and any competent hand would have kept 3 blades in reserve at the outer roof to sweep the corridor once the study was secured. He met them in the corridor turning with the mop shaft in his hands and the black cord in his teeth. He took the first with the mop shaft to the throat, low and fast. He took the second with the doorknob out of his pocket to the temple, the same wet crack he had made 40 minutes earlier. He took the third with his own hands, because the third was faster than the other 2, and the mop shaft was already spent in the first cloth's throat, and there was no time to bring the doorknob around a second time. He put the third cloth down on the black floor of the corridor with his hands on its throat and his knee on its chest. It struggled hard. It reached, at the last, for a small blade in its belt. He caught the wrist and turned it over the way his father had turned his brother's wrist, and the way later he had shown the prince. The knife fell. It hit the black floor. He held the throat until the throat stopped moving. He said, 33. He said, and he was breathing very hard now, 34 is in the Empress's chamber. 35 is with him. He got up. He picked up the mop shaft. He picked up the doorknob. He wiped both on his tunic. He walked, at the same slow, patient pace, down the corridor to the Empress's sleeping chamber. He did not run. He did not shout. He did not, so far as she could see on the monitor in her hand, look up. She watched him come. She had, in the last 4 minutes, understood a very great many things. She had understood that the 4th spire had put the 7 tokens in the crucible on the first day. She had understood that the letters her husband had been signing on his balcony had not been trade letters. She had understood that the 2 extra Croth Wade Corbin had counted as missing from the study were not in fact Croth. She had understood that one of the 2 extras was her husband. She had understood above all that a small mammal from a cold Terran mill town was, at that very moment, walking down her corridor with a doorknob in his hand and a broken piece of a mop in the other and a great deal of Croth blood on his grey tunic to kill her husband for her. She held the monitor in both hands. She did not lift the plasma veil. She sat, in her plain reading gown, on the edge of her bed, and she waited. The chamber door opened at the 5th bell. Wade Corbin walked in with the mop shaft in his left hand and the vulgar brass doorknob in his right. He was bleeding a great deal now, from a new wound she could not see from her side of the veil. He walked past her bed without looking at her. He walked to the far corner of her sleeping chamber, where the second ventilation grill of the room had, at some point in the last minute, silently come down. She had not, until that moment, seen the grill. Prince Ecthal of the 4th Spire stepped out of the corner in the outer skin of a dead Croth, with a plasma lance in his hand, and a 5th Croth at his shoulder in the same skin, and both of them stepped between the human and the empress, with the practiced ease of men who had, 40 seconds earlier, been very sure of the timing of the night. The prince fired. The plasma lance made the small, clean, tearing sound the lance made. It went straight through the outer stone of Wade Corbin's left thigh and out the other side. It cauterized as it went. Wade Corbin did not fall. He rocked forward a hand's width and rocked back and kept walking, at the speed of a slow, patient man. The Croth at the prince's shoulder came in with a polymer blade. Wade Corbin took the blade on the mop shaft. The mop shaft splintered. He drove the splintered end into the base of the Croth's throat. The Croth went down, 34. The prince fired the lance again. This one caught the human in the meat of the left side of his belly. Wade Corbin took the shot. He took it. He kept walking. He was by then 3 steps from the prince. The prince said, in the very small voice of a man who has just understood a joke a full second late, "Wade Corbin, you will step back." Wade Corbin said, in a voice like gravel poured slowly, "My lord, I do not do this work anymore. I did tell you." He reached to his belt. From a pocket she had not seen, he pulled a small, heavy wrench of Terran steel with a black rubber grip, of the sort a maintenance drone in the outer corridor carried for a difficult pipe. She would learn later that he had taken the wrench off a maintenance drone in the outer corridor at the 4th bell that afternoon, in the middle of his walk in the low garden, exactly the way he had once taken a spar knife off a Vora courier's wrist. She would learn that he had put the wrench under the Crucible Master's 3rd bell water bucket next to the pre-tied loop of the black cord. She would learn that he had walked past the bucket on the way to the Empress's chamber and picked the wrench up without breaking stride. He put the prince down with the wrench in one swing. It was the same elbow-tight swing his father had used on frozen pipes in Ashfok. It was the same swing he had used on his brother's cleaver 30 years earlier, in a kitchen with a smell of soup and wet coal. It was the swing of a man who had grown up on a mining colony at 1.9 standard gravities, and whose bones had been laid down under a heavy sky. It made the sound of a hammer through the head of a nail. Prince Ecthal of the 4th Spire went down onto the black stone floor of his wife's sleeping chamber and did not get up. Wade Corbin stood over him for a moment. He was bleeding from the left thigh, the left belly, the left hand, and a shallow line across his brow. He was breathing very hard. He was still standing. It was, if she had thought about it, an astonishing thing. She lifted the plasma veil. He turned his head at the sound of the veil coming down. He saw her. He straightened a very small amount, as if remembering some old rule about posture in front of a superior officer. He tried to bow. He did not have the geometry. He staggered a hand's width. He caught himself on the corner of her writing desk. "Ma'am," he said, "Wade Corbin. I have your prince, ma'am. I see him. I have 35 of the 35, ma'am. I see them, Wade Corbin." He looked at her. His slow, stone eyes were, for the first time, tired. He looked in that instant like a very old man. He looked also, in that instant, like a small mammal at the end of a long night. And she was, for one very small, unwilling instant, sorry for the entire arrangement of the universe that had put him on the floor of her private study on a soft morning 90 days earlier with a rag in his hand. He said in a voice like gravel poured slowly for a cup, "Ma'am, "May I sit down?" "Yes." He sat down on the floor, with his back against her writing desk. He set the wrench down beside him. He set the vulgar brass doorknob down on the other side. He looked at his left thigh. There was a clean, round hole through the meat of it, cauterized black at the edge, and a small hot line of fresh blood running past the cauterization down into the black stone of her floor. There was a similar hole in the meat of his left side. He looked at both of them the way a man looks at a piece of laundry that needs mending. He took, from another pocket of his grey tunic, a small silver device the Empress recognized as a field cautery of the Terran assault recovery pattern. He had had it evidently all along. He looked at it. He said quietly, more to himself than to her, "Don't be delicate, fill the hole." He pressed the cautery into the thigh wound. The room filled with a small, clean smell of burned meat. He did not make a sound. He did the same to the belly wound. He did not make a sound then either. The Empress of the Vora Ascendancy watched him do this from the edge of her bed in her plain reading gown. She did not, so far as any court spy could later report, look away. He set the cautery down beside the wrench. He rested his head against the side of her writing desk. He closed his eyes. "Ma'am," he said without opening them, "when you have a moment, could someone bring me a cup of real coffee? Terran, not the paste. Ground beans, ground fresh, hot water, nothing else in it." He opened his eyes. "And ma'am, with respect, tomorrow somebody else polishes the knob." He looked at her and she looked at him, and something in the great tall painted room went very still. Then, without meaning to, Ismariel Ven made a small sound in the back of her throat, high and thin, that no Vora of her line had ever made in living memory. It was, her tutor would have said, if her tutor had lived to hear it, closer to the sound of a wet cough than the sound of a laugh. But it was a laugh, and it belonged to her, and it was for him and the guards outside her chamber door, arriving at that exact moment with their spar knives drawn, heard it, and stopped where they were and did not know what to do with themselves. He did not, at first, laugh back. He watched her from the floor. He watched her the way a man watches a bird decide whether to land on his hand. Then, very slowly, the corners of his flat, wide mouth moved a hand's width, and he closed his eyes again. "That was a joke, ma'am," he said, "in case you were wondering." "I was aware." "Yes, ma'am. Wade Corbin." "Ma'am, the knob is yours if you want it." "No, ma'am, please, let it go to somebody with the time." She stood up from the edge of the bed. She stepped over the body of the fifth Croth. She stepped over the body of her husband. She walked, in her plain reading gown, to the writing desk. She knelt down beside the human on her floor. She put her long, pale hand over his left hand. The blood on his hand was warm. She had not in her life touched a human this way. "Wade Corbin," she said. "Ma'am, you will have your coffee. You will have a physician. You will have, if you would like it, your freedom and passage back to Terra on any cutter of your choosing, or you will have a house here, in the low garden, and any post in the household of the Empress of the Vora Ascendancy you would like to name. Also, you will have back, if the smith can be persuaded to hammer them out of the brass, 7 small pressed things I should not have taken from you." He opened his eyes. He looked at her hand on his hand for a long time. Then he looked at her face. He was, she thought, seeing her clearly for the first time also. "Ma'am," he said, "the medals are not mine anymore. I told you the truth about that." "Then what would you like, Wade Corbin?" He thought about it. His slow, stone eyes moved across her face. He looked, past her, at the vulgar brass doorknob, sitting on the black stone floor of her chamber, next to the wrench that had been his father's swing. "A window that looks east, ma'am," he said, "so I can see the second sun come up. A room warm enough to keep a widower's bones. Once a week, a day I do not have to work, and a cup of real coffee at first bell every morning for as long as I am here. That is all." "Done," she said. She said it in the same voice she had used to say, melt them 90 mornings earlier, and she was surprised this time also by her own voice. She stayed on the floor next to him until the physicians came. He did not, in that time, close his eyes again. He looked once at the doorknob. He looked once at her. He did not hum. She thought as she waited, "It is not the humans who are dangerous. It is the humans who have already been broken and put back together. It is the humans who have a lullaby left over from a sister who is not here. It is the humans who take a joke as an assignment and complete it for 90 days, and then walk out of the room and take a knife off a wrist without looking. It is not," she thought, "that they are invincible. It is that they do not require themselves to be." Later, when the physicians had come and the couriers had come, and the guards outside her chamber door had finally worked out what to do with themselves, and had come inside also, and the body of the prince had been carried out with the folded letter with 3 7-toothed marks and his own name on it still in the pocket of the tanned cloth skin, and the letter had been read to the empress by her private secretary in a voice that shook, and the empress had listened to it without changing her face, and the whole vast obsidian palace of the Vora ascendancy had begun the slow business of understanding what had happened in one small private chamber on one very long night. Later, she got up from the floor and she went and stood at the door of her private study, and she looked at the empty doorknob shaft on the door and thought about a small brown-haired mammal on his knees 90 mornings earlier, humming a tune in a mode her collar could not name. She sent in the morning for the palace smith. She had the vulgar brass doorknob taken off the study door and hammered on her own writing desk back into 7 small pressed things. She could not, of course, restore the sigils. She had them repressed in the sigils of her own household, 7 Ven crowns in a row. She had them mounted on a plain wooden board, and she had the board hung in the study above the writing desk in the place where she read. She put a new knob on the door, plain dark wood, 11 generations. She did not herself polish it. She did not herself need to. Wade Corbin took the small room with the east-facing window. He took the day off in the middle of the week. He took the cup of real coffee at first bell. He did not that year ask for anything else. He walked at her elbow through the low garden. He served her tea. He did not, in her hearing, hum, but she caught him at it one late afternoon in the garden, with the palace children in a small cross-legged line around him, teaching them the tune, and she stood behind a pillar of rose-red stone for a full 10 minutes and listened. Prince Ektal's mother, in her stone tower on the edge of the sea, took her own life on the 3rd day after the news reached her. His household staff scattered. The 4th spire fell inward on itself in the way old families do, slowly, over a season, in 100 small legal defeats. Ismariel Ven did not in public comment. She did not need to. The 9 Moons contract house, for its part, discovered on the 4th day after the 90th night that a very small foreign cutter had docked at its outer belt station in the very deep of the night, and that a small brown-haired mammal in a plain grey tunic had walked, without a weapon, into the private receiving room of the contract house master and had stayed 1 hour and had walked out again. Nobody in the contract house would ever say what was discussed. The contract house from that quarter forward would not accept any commission naming any member of the household of the Vora ascendancy at any price. The housemaster would not, when asked, explain why. He would only say, in the flat trade dialect his own collar translated for him, that he had recently been introduced to the concept of a doorknob. She learned that year a great many things about him she had not previously known. She learned about Ashfork, about the coal in the winter of his 14th year and his sister's 11th, and about the boiler stack on the 3rd gantry that had killed her when she was 28, and about the 7 bodies that had not been recovered whole. She learned about his wife, whose name had been Eleanor, and who had died of a small, ordinary illness 2 Terran years before he had walked onto the auction gantry at Broken Halo Station. She learned about the 11 civilians at Bright Fork. She learned about the coordinates on the second medal, which turned out to be a mining outpost on a small, dead moon, whose name would not, if she said it, mean anything to a Vora ear. She learned about the wrench. It had in fact been his father's. He had taken it off the maintenance drone in the outer corridor and had not needed to, because he could have used any wrench, and he had wanted, on that night, to hold that shape in his hand. She learned about the physics of him also. She had her private secretary find, at last, the little Terran military archive her grandfather had once subscribed to, and she had read the file on Corbin Wade Ellis, 22nd Long Corps, assault recovery, density-adjusted physical performance on record, Cygnus K at 1.9 standard gravities, dense bones, dense muscle, a childhood spent learning to fall wrong for fun. She had the file explained to her by a Terran physician in a small, quiet room of the palace medical wing. The physician had, at the end, looked at her over his little round lenses and said, in perfect trade dialect, "Empress, humans are not as a species particularly hard to kill. We die of infections, we die of cold, we die of grief. We are extremely killable. The trick is that when a human decides you are the thing that must not be permitted to continue existing, the human will keep coming toward you long past the point at which the human should have stopped. It is not that we are strong, it is that we are stubborn. A human is a small mammal with a very long memory and a great many reasons. When you buy one, Empress, you should know what you have." She had thanked him. She had, that night in her private study, under the 7 small, repressed Venn crowns on the wall, opened a book and not read it for a full hour. She learned, over the following year, that Wade Corbin did not really want the freedom, or the passage back to Terra, or the post. He wanted the small, east-facing window. He wanted the coffee at first bell. He wanted the day in the middle of the week. He wanted the walk in the low garden. He wanted the small, cross-legged line of the palace children in a corner of the low garden, and the tune and the Empress on the other side of a pillar of rose-red stone, listening. She did not, in that year, laugh again, but she came close once or twice when he was not looking. 14 years later, when Wade Corbin died of a small, ordinary illness in the small, east-facing room at the age of 51, the Empress of the Vora Ascendancy came herself in a plain hood to sit at the edge of his cot. She held his left hand in her long, pale hand. He looked at her, at the last, with the same slow, patient stone eyes. He said, in a voice like gravel poured slowly for a cup, "Ma'am, Wade Corbin, there is a tune I would like to leave in the garden. It is already there." He closed his eyes. He did not open them again. She had the 7 Venn crowns taken off the wall of her private study that afternoon. She had them melted on her own writing desk back into 7 small pressed things. She had the pressed things recut this time. In the sigils he had, on the 3rd hour of their acquaintance, told her the truth about Bright Fork, the dead moon whose name did not mean anything to a Vora ear. 2 others she had learned during the 14 years. 3 she invented herself, because he had not in his life taken credit for everything he had done. She had them mounted on the same plain wooden board. She hung the board above the small east-facing window in the small warm room, and she left it there for as long as she reigned. Her successor left it also. So did the successor after that. The room, in the long official histories of the Palace of the Vora Ascendancy, is not marked. The board, in those same histories, is not mentioned. But every Empress of the line, on the morning of her coronation, walks alone into the small east-facing room and stands for a full minute with her hand on the sill of the window through which the second sun comes up, because that is the ritual. And because a long time ago a small mammal with a lullaby lived there, and because the empress who built the palace has left, in a private letter to each of her heirs, the same 7 words. Do not underestimate the ones who kneel. What a journey! That is what love without a name looks like when you set it in a palace and give it a doorknob to polish. The real strength in this story was never the wrench, and never the density of a mining colony spine, and never the count of 35 polymer blades on a black stone floor. The real strength was a man who knew exactly who he was, and who let a queen find out on her own time. If a story like this moved something in you tonight, leave your like right now, because the like is what keeps these stories alive out here in the dark. Share it with the friend who also loves science fiction, where the human, against everything the galaxy expects, quietly refuses to lose. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the little bell, so the next HFY epic finds you the night it drops. And tell me, honestly, down in the comments, which one you would have chosen if you had been Wade Corbin on the 90th morning. The passage home to a quiet Terran mill town where nobody would ever ask you to polish anything again, or the small east-facing room in an alien palace, with the coffee at first bell and the empress on the other side of the pillar, listening. Keep your eyes on the empty places between the stars. There are more small mammals out there than the galaxy has yet counted.